All right. So I was going to begin by talking about someone that I tried the method of levels with, and I'll be really interested to get your feedback. So,
Sounds good.
yeah. So this is one of our this is a famous client for our practice. So I'm going to have to be really careful not to say many specifics about him because he's frustrated many people. So, um, so he's always on the verge. He's always threatening suicide. That's been going on for years. And so let me set the background for him. So it took us a while to figure out that he had anorexia because we were biased. We had a sex age bias. And we didn't think an older male could be anorexic. We thought it had to be younger females. And we were wrong. You know, I mean, one day he let me know that he vomited everything he ate, and he took, 27 laxatives a day, and, he thought he was hideously fat, and, wow. But so he's, so now fast forward to he's living on his own now.
Mm-hmm.
And he had this fantasy that if he were living on his own, that everything would get better. Because he had been living with his wife, whom he really disliked. And so he's now living on his own, and he comes into the session yesterday morning to announce that nothing had changed and things are really horrible, and he's just going to starve himself to death and die. So, so let me try to backtrack. Let me try and remember different things that I said, so we can bring it into method of levels. So I said something like, "Wow, I thought we both thought that things would get better when you were living on your own." And he said, "Well, I did, and they didn't. Everything is bad." And so I said, "Well, what is bad?" And he said, "Well, I'm just as depressed as I ever was, and now it's worse because no one visits me." So I said, "Well, who doesn't visit you?" And he said, "Well, no one visits me." And I said, "Well, specifically, who is no one?" And he said, "Well, my daughter doesn't visit me and my son doesn't visit me." And so, so I said, "So when is the last time your daughter visited you?" And he said, "Well, she visited me at the first of the month when she wants money. All she wants me for is money." And I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "Well, I gave her money." And I said, "And then what happened?" And he said, "Well, she went away and didn't come back." And I said, "Well, okay. So when was the last time your son visited you?" And he said, "He's never visited me." And I said, "Well, do you invite him?" And he said, "Yeah, I call him." And I said, "So what do you say to him?" And he said, I ask him to come over and watch TV. And he says he's busy." And I'm like, "Well, I mean, that doesn't sound very exciting to me. If I were 8 years old, I probably wouldn't be that thrilled about going over to my dad's house to watch TV when I could watch TV at home. Like, is that the best you can do?" And he says, "Well, that's all I want to do." And I said, "Well, it could be that 8-year-olds want to do more than watch TV. Could that be?" And he said, "Well, that's all I can do is watch TV." So, so he's like, it just has to end. I just have to kill myself. And 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 I'm like, well, any new plans for how you're going to kill yourself? And he's like, no, the usual. And I'm like, okay. So, because I know what the usual is. And the usual hasn't happened in a really long time. And interestingly, I also noticed that he's put on some weight. So I don't say anything about that. And so I say to him, so here you are sitting with me, and your whole goal is apparently to kill yourself. And you made an appointment to see me, and you brought yourself over here. And you're sitting in the chair across from me. And you know I'm a hideous optimist. You already know what a disgusting positive thinker I am. So what gives? Like, why are you here? What do you want? And he said, I don't know. And so I'm like, well, I don't know either, because you already know what a hopeless optimist I am. And he said, you're a fool. And I said, I know. And I said, so why did you come to see a fool? And he said, I don't know. And I said, so you probably don't want me to go through the list of all the things that I find exciting that I would recommend that you do if I were you, sitting across from me, because of the things I would do if I were you. And you're not going to do any of them, so you probably don't want to hear them, right? And he said, right, I don't want to hear them. I said, well, I won't tell you. So, and I was with one of our trainees. I was with one of the residents, and I looked at her. I said, I'm not speaking loudly enough for him to hear, but if I were him, I would get a dog. And she said, oh yeah, me too. And he looks at us and he said, I heard you. And I said, oh, we must not have whispered loudly enough. And so at one point he pauses, and I try the great Tim trick. I say, did something just pass through your mind at that moment? And he said, no. so I said, oh, sorry. So then I said, so, it's really puzzling that you're here, because it seems like there's a part of you who likes to come talk to me, an optimist, even though there's a part of you who wants to die and is a pessimist. And I said, I'm really confused. Like, how do you explain that? And he said, you're a fool. He repeated himself. He said, only fools are optimists. And I'm like, well, all right. So I'm still puzzled. And he said, I'm just going to go be with my mother. Now I know his mother's dead. And I'm like, okay. So have you been talking to her lately? And he looks at me and says, no, I'm not crazy. And I said, well, I know a lot of people who talk to dead people, so I just wanted to check it out. Seems okay to me. And he said, you're a fool. So anyway, so I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you, because everything I could tell you would be stupid. It's just that optimistic bullshit that you really don't want to hear. Because, there's all kinds of things I like to do. I like to hike. I like to go work in the garden. I like to read books. I like to, write poetry. I like to, smoke cigars on the porch. There's a lot of things I like to do, and I know you don't like to do any of them. So I don't know what to say to you, because I don't know why you're here. I don't know what you want from me. I know you brought yourself here. And he said, I don't want anything. I'm like, well, okay, cool. Well, I don't have anything, so at least we're in agreement there. You don't want anything, and I don't have anything to offer you. But I'm really touched that in the midst of your seriously wanting to die, that you came to see me, knowing what a fool and an optimist and an idealist I am. You bothered to come to this appointment. and you've spent more time with me than you've ever spent before in your whole life. You know, by this time it's like going on 50 minutes, you know, which is a record for him. And he's like, well, I don't know why I come. I'm not going to come again. And I said, well, I'd like it if you come again. You know, I know I'm a fool and irritating and, you know, but if not you, I just have to see somebody else and they might not be as fun, you know? And so at least you're a known evil as opposed to an unknown evil. So I'm sure hoping you'll make another appointment. And he said, no, I'm just going to die. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe you could come one more time before you die. And he said, no, never. And so let me think if there's anything else that went on. There's probably a few other things that went on, but that's the gist of it. And so finally he says, well, I'm wasting your time and my time. And I'm like, well, I get paid no matter what, so you're not wasting my time. I'm like, I look at the resident, I said, we could have a lot worse things to do than see this guy. And she says, yeah, he's not bad. He's all right. He's kind of entertaining. I'm like, yeah. And he says, all right, I'm leaving. So he gets up, you know, and he walks out and slams the door shut. And okay, so that's that. And then interesting enough, I left out this part. So there's a part where the resident, being a good resident, says, well, so are you taking your medications? And he says, no. He says, none of that works. And she says, well, you said it worked before. He said, only for 2 days. He said, for 2 days it made me feel good and then it all went away. And she said, well, I'd do it for 2 days, given how bad you sound. I mean, you sound awful. If I could get 2 days of not feeling like that, I'd do anything. And he said, you're stupid. So she said, well, I work with him. He's stupid too. Now, this is a good resident because she has no training in psychiatry. So this is why she's so good. You can imagine how terrible a trained psychiatric resident would have been. So, so we're like, well, okay, fine. You're not taking any of your medicine. Well, all right, because it doesn't work, you know. And I'm like, oh, you know, dude, we got to ask you, you know, you want to try something else? And he's like, no, none of that shit works. And so I'm like, well, yeah, you know, it doesn't actually work all that well. You know, it's not designed to make you well. It's just designed to take the edge off. And, you know, so I guess it's not doing it for you. So fine, whatever. You know, if you change your mind, let us know. He's like, I don't want anything. You know, I'm not taking any medicine. I'm like, okay, whatever, you know, whatever you want to do. So I get a message. Okay, so that's our Tuesday morning. And this is our Wednesday evening. So I get a message this morning. Where's his medicine? He wants to take his medicine. And so, you know, I mean, and the resident, being a good resident, took all of his medications off his health record, you know, his electronic health record, because he wasn't taking anything. So this morning I added everything that we had given him back, which was risperidone and mirtazapine. So I tried to call him, and of course he didn't answer the phone. So I told the nurse, I said, look, he's not answering the phone for me. You get a hold of him, tell him it's waiting at the drugstore. And if he wants something else, tell him to come see me. Otherwise, he's got his usual stuff and he can pick it up. So that was my method of levels, sort of maybe session that I sort of maybe had, pretending to be you, hoping that I did it sort of like you would have done it. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it sounds amazing, Lewis. What there's lots in there that's very similar. I guess for one of the things I was thinking that you really picked up on was the intrigue about why he would be turning up to a session when he knows nothing's going to work and just wants to kill himself anyway. So that I think, like you, I'd be really interested in having him talk more about, and you know, that kind of stuff that you seem to have spent a bit of time on. Probably from a therapist perspective, I'd be interested in what what your goal was for the session. What were you kind of wanting to have happen or get out of the session, or for him to get out of the session?
My goal was to pretend to be you and to see what would happen.
And well, so on that, I guess, was that session different from sessions you've had in the past with him?
He stayed longer. He stayed for a whole hour. I didn't feel stressed.
Mm-hmm.
The resident didn't feel stressed.
Oh, wow. Wow, okay.
You know, the medical student was going nuts in the corner. But too bad for him. He's like, what are you guys doing? Committing malpractice? You guys are crazy. I think we destroyed everything he'd ever learned about psychiatry.
About you, yeah.
Yeah, in one fell swoop. But you know, I really don't know what to say to this guy. And so, so my goal, I guess, was to keep him for the whole session and to not be stressed. You know, which involves not trying to fix him, for sure. Because that won't work.
Yeah.
I mean, many people have tried to fix this guy. So,
and for me, that really fits in with the optimistic kind of approach. I think for me, the perceptual control theory and method of levels is probably the ultimate optimistic therapy, because it really says, as long as you kind of provide the space and the time, people really will fix themselves. And so it's interesting that you comment on the stress. I think it does, at least from for me and other people I know who have used it for a long time, it does take a lot of that kind of stress and pressure out of being a therapist. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can focus on, like in my work and also some of my colleagues and people I'm supervising, where we're constantly trying to reflect on a session and figure out how we could have done it better and what we could have done differently. But it's a different focus from trying to focus on fixing the client or what they should be doing differently, I guess. So that, I remember one of my teachers once said, it's a bit like a tennis coaching lesson, you know, that you should be the coach at the net, just hitting the balls back, and the client should be the one running all over the place, working really hard. That if you're working hard and the client's relaxed, it's the wrong way around. And for me, that's often with other therapies I'm familiar with, like cognitive behavior therapy and so on. Therapists work really hard at finding the right activity and explaining it and having different sheets to use and checking up on homework and all that kind of stuff. With MOL, I think it's hard work from the point of view of you have to really be present in the session and be kind of tracking the conversation and remembering all the different threads and asking questions about this and that. And so there's kind of a mental alertness. I think you have to really be up for an MOL session from a therapist perspective, but it's not the same kind of working hard that I think happens in other therapies. So yeah, the idea in MOL is very much that they should be the ones doing the work, and that kind of tension about, you don't want to be here, you want to kill yourself, yet here you are sitting in a room talking to a fool. Like, how do you explain that? That's exactly the kind of the focus, and sounds like you really kind of honed in on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of like the only thing that was really happening in the room at the time, which was the incredible contradiction between what he was saying and the fact that he was there.
You know, there used to be, I'm sure it's still alive and well, but as a teacher, we were often taking courses or given workshops on different ways of controlling behavior, especially as behavior really has escalated with a lot of kids. And that was one of the ones that was very popular. So, you'd have this kid freaking out in the class and they would be saying, screaming at you, "You're an idiot." And you'd go, "Yeah, I really feel like that. I am one right now." And it would just throw everything off balance. And often it would just de-escalate the situation immediately, and you could kind of go on with things, and then maybe talk privately with the student after. But
Afterwards,
it happened.
That's a great observation.
Really well. But it was often a difficult thing for teachers to do, just to kind of say that back, But I used it all the time, so it was kind of it's quite effective.
Well, when you kind of get the sense that there's actually a purpose or a meaning behind the words other than the words themselves, it kind of, I think, helps you take the sting, I guess, out of the session. I can remember working with a client, and she was diagnosed with all sorts of things. Borderline personality disorder was one of them. And I started the MOL session and asked her a few questions, and she started screaming at me saying, "All you do is asking me questions." And I said, "Well, how would you like me to talk to you?" And she said, "That's another question."
Right.
But just, for me, understanding that if you give people, as I said, the time and the space, they'll kind of their own kind of stuff will work it through is amazingly liberating, I think.
Yeah, and at least with the guy I'm talking about, he's probably had every suggestion known to humanity.
Yeah.
This has been going on for years.
Yeah.
And
I remember, Lewis, just to butt in, Bill Powers, the guy who developed the theory, and he supervised me really closely when I was in Scotland developing this kind of stuff. I'd send him tapes and all that sort of business. And he said that he starts from the assumption that the client in front of him is at least as smart as he is and has probably thought of any strategy that he could suggest or any idea, or has probably been told it before by friends or relatives or other people. So it can't be a lack of suggestions that's the problem. If the problem's still there, it's why hasn't one of those suggestions stuck?
right.
And why isn't the person doing the things that they know they could or should be doing? So that's more of, I guess, the focus on from an MOL perspective. I mean, there are genuinely some times where people do have like a lack of knowledge or education, or they just don't know if they did that rather than that. I mean, I know when you go into airports, in the bathrooms in airports, the taps always seem to you have to do different things to get the water to come out. And so there's certainly situations where people might have a lack of knowledge, but in a lot of the people I see, and I'm sure it's the same with you, when a problem has existed for a long period of time, it's not a shortage of advice or suggestions that's the problem. People have usually had loads of things suggested to them. So MOL's more about why hasn't anything worked before, and what is it that's kind of stopping things from working.
Yeah, I've always had that perspective too. That people already, by the time they get to me, they've already been given all the advice they could possibly get. And there's probably nothing I could think of that they haven't already been told. And so giving advice, doesn't really get us anywhere. Besides making people annoyed.
Irritating them.
Irritating them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I have to show you. This is our version of kangaroo.
I've been looking at your T-shirt. I love it.
Yeah.
We were desperately trying to find a moose while we were over there, and we never did.
Yeah.
Moose, it looks great.
Car. Moose win.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We've actually only seen 2 moose this year.
Is that right?
Yeah. So They're shy buggers. They're hard to
Mm.
find. They
And we understood in New Hampshire that they'd been, the numbers had really decreased because of ticks or something. So
yeah,
that's a shame.
yeah, and they're. It turns out that they're amphibious, which is
Oh,
interesting. They can breathe. I mean, they don't breathe underwater, I guess, but they hold their breath for an incredibly long time underwater.
hmm.
So they can hide out underwater,
Ah,
which makes them hard to find.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, but um, in Ontario, when there seems to be trade-off years, moose are in higher numbers, and then deer come
Ah,
back. And
huh.
so we've had moose come down into where I lived in, you call it Southern Ontario, and then
Wow.
they kind of migrate, or something happens to them. But there seems to be that trade-off, and I understand that deer carry some disease that
Yeah.
affects the moose, and then the other way around.
Okay.
But at Algonquin Park, you can always see moose.
Huh.
You have to come up. You have to go up
That
to
would be
Ontario.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That would be great.
So you'll have to come back to North America, Tim.
That would be awesome. I'd love
Yeah.
to.
Hey, I saw your name in a paper today that I was reading. I was talking to the residents about the critiques of DSM, and I
Hmm.
saw that you were on a committee, I think of the American Psychological Association
Yeah.
for alternative diagnostic systems.
There was a group of people from a small group from the US and from the UK who got together, and before a virtual group, they established a website and so on. And I was invited to be on that. Um, so we had a meeting in Washington at one point, and I joked that I was the Southern Hemisphere representative because I was the only one um, from this way. But it was a kind of an interesting. People posted various blog articles and so on. It was quite active for a while. But the website has been, I think it's still there, but it's kind of been archived now, and the group doesn't meet anymore.
Too bad.
Mm.
We were talking today about overthrowing DSM,
Hmm.
and that you didn't need DSM to prescribe for people, and that the drugs didn't really work anyway.
Mm.
so, so we're really just talking about side effects.
Oh wow.
So, but you were in one of the papers that I shared with the residents. I think it
Huh.
was from the Journal of Humanistic Psychology.
Oh, okay.
It was writing about their process of critiquing DSM-5.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah. There was a lot of stuff going on around that at the way that the categories are actually constructed and all that kind of stuff. Alan Francis, I think, he wrote a book called Saving Normal, which sort of critiqued DSM, and he was the chair of DSM-4, I think. So
Right, right.
so knew DSM well, but was quite critical of DSM-5. But for me, he didn't really go far enough. His problem was that we were just creating too many categories now, but he kind of thought, I think he thinks that the category kind of idea is okay. We've gone a bit too far with it. Whereas I would say that I don't think we need the categories at all. I think we can kind of work with people and their problems without having to box them into artificial categories.
So I found a paper from Stanford University that said that the American psychiatric categorization of mental illness parallels the categorization of plants by
Hmm.
botany.
Oh
And
wow,
that the rate of increase of mental illnesses equals the rate of increase of recognition of plant species.
that's amazing.
I don't know what to make of that,
Huh?
but at
That's
least it
incredible.
came from Stanford.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lewis, I've got to duck out for a minute. It should be about 10 minutes or so, and I'll be back.
All right. We'll see you when you come back.
You bet.
All right. Any other discussion about the case that I presented before I talk a little bit about chapters 9? Oh, I know what I wanted to mention. I went onto the website with for the Google Classroom with just the ID, and I was able to get into the about part and get all the papers.
Yeah, I still don't have it.
Hmm.
I don't have the word about there at all. I go to the classroom folder and there's nothing, just one thing I had put in there myself. I don't know what, oh, hey, wait a sec. I just saw the word. It's moved.
Right. It moved. Yes.
Yes.
It
And
moved.
there it is. Hallelujah.
How about that?
Okay.
It moved.
It's very small. It's faint and it's as far to the right as you can possibly go.
Right.
Okay.
They did that. I don't know why they did that.
Yeah, that's annoying.
Everyone is annoying.
And it's, yeah. Okay, so there. And so today we're looking at what?
Today we're looking at chapter 9, and I haven't put it up yet for
Okay.
everyone to read because I was obsessed with figuring out why you couldn't see the word about.
Yeah.
But
But I'm sure that wasn't there last week, Lewis.
well, things change, thank God.
Yeah.
So I did put up the recording from last week.
Yes, all of that's there.
Right
Right.
there, and tomorrow I will put up chapters 9 through 12 from the book,
Okay.
so that they'll be up. So, but we can talk about them. Any other discussion before we jump into talking about the chapters? Anyone else try it out besides me?
I try it out with myself.
Oh, okay. How did that go?
Like the stepping up, the going back and bringing up something from the back, my past, and then kind of dealing with it in the present, and then kind of going through those things. It's been very interesting and very helpful.
Oh, good.
I don't have it. I'm practicing on myself only because I don't really want to try it with anybody else just yet, but it does work. It's an effective kind of thing, because I guess for me right now, I'm just thinking about actually in the coyote healing, when you talk about having to look at every aspect of your life and every aspect is suspect. And so going back to the past and kind of thinking, what have I not let go of? And, those kinds of things. So I find that methods of levels, or just that idea of the forefront and the foreground, and you know what, I've forgotten the words already. The foreground and the background, and then moving it up to the foreground, and then kind of thinking it through has been really helpful. It's just sometimes a mental image is
Right. And I found a paper today about yoga psychotherapy from 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently they knew this and used this technique. So it's probably older than perhaps people think.
Uh-huh.
And they were also using most of the techniques of cognitive behavior therapy 2,500 years ago too. So it's comforting to know that there's probably nothing new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about something from this book?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. When you talked about the what you learned from your studies of medical miracles and with Native American healers, and number 2 was the importance of acceptance and surrender. So you say, nevertheless, we must continue wanting, for the strength of our desire fuels the birth of miracles. When desire becomes obsessive, the goals move further away. Obsession communicates that the goal is hard or impossible. Easy desire is a phrase for contemplation. So that still ring true for you, or?
It does, yeah. Because I think when we, the differences between a kind of free-floating desire, like, gee, this is what I would really like, and a kind of demanding, that by George, you better give me this. And I think that the demanding alienates the spirits, who may or may not be able to help you anyway. But if they could help you, and you demand them to help you, they're more likely not to. Whereas if you just say, well, hey, all things being equal, if it's not too much trouble for you guys, and, you're feeling generous, I'd really like, X, Y, and Z, but, I get it, maybe you can't help, and maybe you're just too busy or whatever, but, something to think about, just saying, that's all. So, so it's a kind of, the yoga psychotherapy that I read today, would describe it as a kind of non-attachment. There's such a thing as being non-attached and still wanting something or asking for something, but without being attached to whether you get it or not, which is impossible. But, we can move toward impossible things.
Keep it as a goal.
To a degree.
Okay.
Yeah.
I go back to this book so often, and to the Coyote Medicine, and then I love Coyote Wisdom. I'm still slogging through the mapping, the mind mapping. That's I'm still reading through it, but and I just wanted to show Jana, especially for you. Do you know this author, Basil Johnson? I'm sure he's long gone, but he was a linguist and lecturer at the Department of Ethnology at the Royal Ontario Museum. And he's written 3 books. The other 2 I had signed by him, but I left them at the First Nations school I was at. But I kept this one, The Ceremonies. And he has stories and ceremonies through there. Like, it's really interesting. For example, the tobacco ceremony and the origin of it. So it's just these are older books. I don't know where you'd even find them anymore. University of Nebraska Press.
Oh, they have everything.
Yeah, Bison Books, because it was published in 1982. But so all the ceremonies are there: Vision Quest, Warpath, Marriage Ceremony, Society of Medicine, like the Medawin. It's and he writes both in English and in Anishinaabemowin as well. So it's just like, for a source of stories, it's really quite interesting as well.
I'll look for that.
I'll have to check that out. That seems really good.
Yeah, he was quite a gentleman. I met him once. He taught in the same school as my aunt as well. He was a teacher as well. So that's Basil Johnston. And the other one's called, what are these other 2? But this ceremonies one is quite,
Wow.
Ojibwe ceremonies is this one, The Song of Hiawatha. But Ojibwe heritage and Ojibwe tales. Ojibwe tales is really full of stories.
Wow.
And teaching stories. So just thought I'd make you.
Yeah,
aware.
thank you.
My favorite news.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
got this one, which is a compilation of many nations. He's got it grouped by creation stories or building the earth or
Yeah.
various different categories, and it's very fun to look at the similarities and the differences.
Yeah. Yeah. And who's the author on that one, Jana?
This one is, let's see, Erdoes and Ortiz.
Okay. Ortiz, yeah. There was an Ortiz.
What I find kind of fun is that with each story, he tells where he heard it and who told it. So, you know, what kind of ceremony or what kind of group he was with. And yeah, retold from George Bird, Grinnell, and other sources around 1910. So he dates when he heard these stories. And I'm finding it's another one of those books I don't want to put down. I just keep reading and reading.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about Tim's ideas, and then we'll have some more discussion. I'm going to start with chapter 9, which is where we ended last time with chapter 8. And so in chapter 9, he says that each session is a discrete event. So it doesn't depend on what came before it, and it doesn't depend on what comes after it. And that each time may be the only time you hear about whatever you hear about in that session. And he says
You're
that,
just barely coming through.
what?
You're just barely coming through.
Oh, okay, hold on, and I'll get the headset. Just a minute, and I'll get the headset, because I was derelict in getting it. All right, sorry, I have my headset now. Hopefully you talk to each other during that pause. So here we go. Let's see.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay. Hey, Tim, you're back.
I'm back.
I had to get my headset because it was getting too quiet on my end. Yeah. So we were going on to talk about your book,
hmm
and we're up to chapter 9, by the way.
Oh, wow.
So we're making great progress.
Uh-huh.
And I was talking about the idea that each session begins anew, and which I think in the work that I do is both true but there's another element that differs, and
Uh-huh.
I don't know if it's necessary. You know, I was reading this paper that you were mentioned, in which you were mentioned, talked about how little of what we do is necessary for what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And they said 1% of the variance. I've heard 15% in some other papers, but I do know that it's relatively small.
Mm.
But I thought about that one of the things that I focus on is developing the story, developing the identity narrative that someone can come back to and revise on their own even. We're doing this project where I work where we're looking at how recording the life story, the person's life story, and then giving it to the primary care doctor to read affects the doctor-patient relationship. And does the change in the doctor-patient relationship lead to improvement in the patient's pain, anxiety, depression? Those are the three things we're measuring. And but we come back to the life story. We give it to them and to take home, the patient, that is. The doctor gets to read it also, but we give it to them to take home and work on. And anytime they want, they can come back and change it. They can revise it. They can modify it. They can change their identity to us when they want to. And so I was thinking about how that's a way in which there's a historicity possible in the sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Though I tend to be similar to you, I tend to, when I start with someone, I tend to say, well, what shall we do today? Or I tend to say, well, what brings us together today?
Mm-hmm.
Not assuming that I know what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Though they could say, well, I revised my story and I want to give it to you to update. And I'm like, cool. I'll load it up in the health record, and I'll send it out to your primary care doctor to know that you've changed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also I think the other thing that we do is we keep mind maps that people can revise over time. So we're keeping a map. We're creating maps of the characters who live within their mind. And I think some of these characters exist at what you would call different levels of perceptual control or different hierarchies. So there's meta characters, and there's ordinary characters. So Old Testament God would be a meta character, whereas your sister would be an ordinary character. But they're all in there talking about you. So so we might also update the map if somebody came in and said, hey, I found a new character. We're like, oh, wow, who is it? But I thought, on page 104, I thought you introduced some good starting questions, like you say, what can I help you with? What's on your mind today? What would you like to discuss? What brings you along to see me? Where would you like to start today? And I think that's very parallel to how we're approaching things.
Yeah.
Because I totally agree that the juice is in the present moment. It's not in the past and it's not in the future. But it's in the present moment. And certainly, if anybody wants to jump in and talk, please feel free to do so, because I don't actually need to monopolize the conversation. I'm used to it because I teach medical students, so I don't have to. so anyway, Tim says that he doesn't talk much about the process of therapy because he prefers to spend as much time as he can providing clients with an experience of the process. And
And can I say there, Lewis, that's something that's evolved with my practice. So when I first started developing this stuff, I would have the first session as kind of half the session I would sort of explain the process and so on, and the other half would be getting some information about them and about what their problem is and what brings them along and what they'd like to get out of the session. And I remember, and I used to explain that at the beginning, you know, we'll spend half the session doing this and half the session doing that. And I remember one of the patients I was seeing in the early days, I said all that and I said, you know, does that sound okay? And she said, yep, that's fine. And I said, so how would you like to start? Do you want to tell me what brings you along first, or should we start with me explaining the process to you first? And she said, oh, no, you can start. And so I was about to launch into my usual spiel, and she put up a hand and said, only joking. And she wanted to tell her story. But then I kind of thought, so that's how I used to start. And then I thought, well, instead of just assuming everyone wants to know what's behind how I'm going to talk to them, maybe I should ask them. So then I just started asking people, do you want to know about this approach before we launch into it? And most people said, no, you're the doctor. I trust that you know what you're doing. And if people do want to know, I talk to them a bit about it. But sometimes it's easier to talk to them about it once they've had an experience of it as well. So so it's not, for me, it's not an either or thing. If people want to know, I'll talk to them about it, but I don't kind of assume everyone needs to know in order for the process to happen.
yeah, you know, I have to say that I have a lot of difficulty describing to people what I do. So I know people call me on the phone and they say, so we're thinking of coming to see you. What do you do? And I'm like, well, why would you be thinking to come to see me if you don't know what I do?
You don't know what I do.
Yeah, I suppose that's MOL on the phone.
Yeah.
Like right away, I'm like, well, why would you even think of coming to see me?
Why did you call me?
Why did you call me? And so one response that I get is people say, I'm looking for a shaman. And so I say, well, I'm not a shaman, since they live in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably 80% of those people say, well, can you refer me to a shaman? I'm like, well, where do you live? And they tell me. And then I'm like, well, okay, I'll send me an email and I'll try and find a shaman. And mostly I don't, because there aren't any. I mean, real shamans. Or some people say, I'm looking for a healer. And then I say, well, I'm not a healer. So I get very little business, unfortunately, because I'm not those things, really. And then sometimes people say, well, I don't know what I'm looking for. And I'm like, well, neither do I. But, you know, I like to talk to people, and I like to do some guided imagery, and I like to do some ceremony, and I like to do some body work, and I like to have fun. And, you know, sometimes people get something out of it, and sometimes they don't. And then a bunch of people say, well, I really want to go to someone who gets results every time. Okay, well, that's cool. And then a few people actually show up, which is why you see I don't have much of a private practice. Mostly I work at the university, so where they pay me a salary, thank God. But it's interesting when people actually show up. We tend to have a really good time. So I suppose that's sort of like my version of these questions. You know, I'm doing telephone screening. Like, are you crazy enough to come see me? You know, and I certainly don't. I mean, in the non-university work that I do, I don't want to have to fix anyone.
Mm.
I'm really interested in joint explorations of consciousness space and what could happen if we were to do that. And playing with energy and spirits and
Mm-hmm.
all these kinds of things. But I don't want the burden of having to help anyone. You know? Because I do that enough at work. That's work.
Mhm.
I have to fight with those people enough. Like,
And it is a bit of a burden, Lewis. You're absolutely right. I think that's one of the other kind of dimensions to giving advice or suggestions, that when you're the advice giver, it's kind of there's some responsibility in whether or not the advice is effective or successful, or whether it works, and that's part of it for me, I guess. I don't want that responsibility.
me neither. And and you know, I don't know about Australia, but in the United States, there's such a focus on the thing that works,
Mm.
and not
Mm.
I work or you work.
Yep. Yep.
But it's always the thing that works.
Yep.
So and realistically, it's not the thing, it's
Mm.
you. You work.
Mm. Mm.
And
Yep.
yet that's so non-American culture.
Yeah. In fact, it's a fantastic point. That was one of the things that came out of the work that I did over there. So we were looking at people who establish in services, so health services and schools and so on, establishing the idea of ongoing monitoring and evaluation, so that you could constantly kind of adapt or tweak services so that they were continuing to be what the recipients wanted. And what we found was that there was a real difference between evaluations where you do like a pre and a post evaluation and you determine whether or not the intervention worked, as opposed to this particular approach, which was much more like kind of a learning model. So we just wanted to find out what was going okay, what wasn't, and we'd change the things that weren't and keep the things going that were going okay. And what we've got a kind of writing up a paper at the moment, and one of the points we're making is that traditional methodologies like randomized controlled trials are based on the assumption that it's the treatment that works, and the design is to decide whether or not this particular treatment is effective or not, and if it is, by how much. Whereas in the work that we did, it was much more about the effectiveness is created by the service provider and the recipient, and the service recipient sort of using the resources of the treatment, but it wasn't the treatment that worked. It was the service recipient kind of created whatever effectiveness there was with the help of the service provider, using the resources of whatever the program was. So it's a really different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, and it seems to me, you know, that the bane of my existence is the randomized controlled trial.
Oh.
That it's such an appropriate methodology for studying healing.
Mm, mm.
You know, I think it's perfect for comparing two drugs.
Yep.
That's what
Or
it was
fields
designed
of wheat.
for.
But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Or whether you put, you know, 2 tons or 1 ton of fertilizer on a field.
On a field, yeah.
You know, but it breaks down when consciousness and volition enter the picture.
Yeah.
And yet its disciples will not concede that point. At least in this country, it's the gold standard. It's sacrosanct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's become the vehicle through which a lot of academics have built prestigious careers. You know, it becomes relatively straightforward to construct a randomized controlled trial to demonstrate. I mean, mostly with in the psychological treatment field anyway, you kind of know what the result's going to be before you even do the trial. That's you calculate how many people you need in order to get a significant result. You compare your treatment with like some reading material or treatment as usual or something that you know isn't going to be very effective. So you're guaranteed of getting good results. So you write some papers, you get some grants, and then you do it all over again
Right.
on a slightly
Right.
different population. It's
Right.
the idea of doing research to genuinely discover something that you didn't know before. Really, in a lot of the reading that I've done, hasn't happened for a long time.
No, you don't get funded to do that.
No, no.
I knew a guy when I was at the University of Pittsburgh who started off studying. He did a randomized controlled trial of Prozac and for depression compared to placebo for ages 20 to 30. And he got $5 or $10 million to do that. And he got, results. And then he did ages 30 to 40. And then he did ages 40 to 50. And then he
Yep.
did ages 50 to 60. And he
Yep.
built his whole career out of like moving forward in 10-year increments with the same trial. And every time getting $10 million to do it.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't know. I mean, it would have been fun to have $10 million every few years, but it had to be really boring.
Oh, well, that's what I mean. That the research isn't the thing anymore. It's the means to the end. It's not the end in itself. The end is about, moving up the academic scale and getting more prestige and being known and all those sorts of. I think, from a PCT perspective, I think they're the higher goals in the hierarchy, not actually kind of furthering our knowledge of how we work or how people can get along better together or it's a big shift.
So let me see what else you say that you can comment on about what you say. So you say at the end of the first appointment, I often ask clients if they have any questions they would like to ask. And that seems, of course, a reasonable ending.
That's probably changed a little bit. That's probably changed a little bit now too. I use do you know the outcome rating scale and the session rating scale, Scott Miller stuff? So I generally give the session rating scale at the end of the session, and if and I might make a comment or two on that. One of the ratings might have been down a little bit, and I'll ask people, or even if they're all high ratings, I might say, there was a bit in the session where we seemed to get a bit stuck or something. Was that something that we should pay attention to and invite people to sort of talk about something in the session if they want to. But more and more, I'm also in a if people have kind of gone up a few levels and they're in a place where they're sort of wondering about things or tossing things around, I'd like to leave them in that kind of place when they leave the session. So I tend to kind of minimize a little bit reflecting on the session at the end of the session because I want them to kind of stay there.
Yeah, that certainly fits what I do when I do guided imagery or so-called hypnosis or I just want them to stay there and not to come back to their usual state of awareness too quickly. I think it was Milton Erickson who said that hypnosis is getting people out of the trance that they're in.
Wow.
Yeah.
He had some great things to say, didn't he?
He did. The other quote that I really like of his is that psychotherapy is replacing bad stories with good stories.
Yep, that's really good.
Yeah. So Getting back to
Hmm.
you, you say, if I do lots of talking, I'm getting in the way. If I do lots of listening and don't ask about upper level events, I'm getting in the way. If I participate in discussions about issues irrelevant to the conflict, I'm getting in the way. If I engage them in teaching activities or give them information to read, I'm getting in the way. So there's a lot of ways to get in the way. So, so you say that sometimes you have to bring people back to what they need to do. You say your job is just to describe to me what is currently going through your mind as we talk about your troubles.
Hmm.
And you say, here are some of the other things that I might mention. My role is to ask you questions to help you develop a different perspective on your problems. I won't give you advice or suggestions or tell you what to do or offer what I see as solutions, because these sessions are about helping you find solutions that haven't occurred to you yet. Even if I could give you advice that worked, all you would have learned by coming along is how to follow advice. I'll assume that you're coming to see me because some aspect of your life isn't the way you want it to be, and you can't make it the way you want. In these sessions, it's not important that I understand your problem. It's important that you teach an understanding different from the one you have now, or you reach an understanding different. That might be useful too, that you teach an understanding different from the one you have now.
Hmm.
There are no right or wrong answers, and I'm not asking questions to try and trip you up. My job is to help you shift your attention to parts of the problem you might not have considered in detail yet, and to search different places of your mind so that you'll be able to generate a solution that you're happy with. So, is that still current for you?
Yeah, mostly that's kind of pretty much on the money. Just to go back to what I was saying before, I probably wouldn't. I don't necessarily say all of those things to every client, but if things come up that seem relevant, I'll talk to clients about some of those points. So sometimes, for example, if someone says, I'm really depressed, and I say, oh, depressed, can you tell me a bit more about depressed? Some clients in the past have had the idea that they mustn't be giving me the answer that I want, because I'm asking, here I am, a clinical psychologist, and they've just told me they're depressed, and I'm asking them what they mean by depressed. Like, surely I must know what depression is. So some clients have got a bit, oh, well, and some occasionally some have said, well, I don't know what you want. Like, what do you want me to say? So at that point I might explain, should we take a step back and just kind of talk a little bit about what's going on here and what we both expect. And that's where I might clarify a point like that. Like I'm not asking questions to kind of lead you in a particular direction or to trip you up, or I'm not even asking questions that I know the answer to. I'm just wanting to understand what your story is and how you see things, how things are for you, and how you're making sense of things right now.
Yeah, I have that experience too, because so many people throw around the labels nowadays. And it's so hard to know what they mean by the label. So somebody says, typically someone will come in to see me and they'll say, well, my bipolar is acting up. And I'm like, well, did you bring him with you? Can I talk to him?
Yeah.
Or they'll say, well, my depression is getting the best of me. And I'm like, well, who is he? I mean, I'm trying to tease out, what they mean, to deconstruct it.
Yeah.
Because they use these labels as if they mean something.
Oh, and with the internet now, I've had people who have kind of gone on and Googled things, and they've come in with a diagnosis that they'll think they'll have OCD or some other malady, and yeah, exactly, the idea that you're not that category is kind of strange to some people.
Yeah. Well, it it becomes a source of self-esteem, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to be of a certain label
Mm.
and to be difficult.
Yeah.
And recently we discovered that there's a sort of there's a subculture, at least partially inclusive of therapists in New York City, who gain points from being on antipsychotic medications,
Yeah.
and they all want
Wow.
to be on them.
Mm.
And we,
What's interesting, isn't it, Lewis? It's kind of almost fashionable to have bipolar disorder. Lots of Hollywood movie stars say they have it, and in a way that it's not so fashionable to have schizophrenia. Like you wouldn't kind of talk about having schizophrenia, but people seem quite open to talking about, as you say, their bipolar problems.
I think we have to romanticize schizophrenia.
Yeah. Make it fashionable.
Yes. Think of all the suffering that could be diminished.
Exactly.
If you romanticize schizophrenia. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And maybe
well, go ahead.
maybe our media, at least here in the U.S., has something to do with that, because people get so much coverage by the media when they go shoot up schools and
Absolutely.
and then the media says, well, he has a history of schizophrenia, whatever, and so that makes them cool, it makes them tough, and that's just a pathetic situation.
So I don't remember any of them being schizophrenic. They were all some other label.
No, I'm pretty sure I don't know if you hear about the ones we have out here in Oregon and whatnot.
I haven't heard that.
But yeah, schizophrenia is mentioned.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I'm behind on my mass shootings, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is sad because it means that there's so many of them.
Yeah, it elevates it to a cool status.
Yeah.
Kind of like gangs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Certainly over here, the label schizophrenia is the one that seems to be more associated with violence and scary stuff. And it's a real shame because people who do attract that sort of diagnosis are much more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than they are the perpetrators. But the image, the media image, you're absolutely right, is very different.
Right. Yeah, I looked into that literature, I think after Columbine. And it's not schizophrenics who commit violent crimes for the most part, but they get the blame.
In fact, we had a really famous shooting, killed an extraordinary number of people in a tourist resort maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, and led to significant and fundamental changes to our gun laws. But his picture for a long time was on the front page of a lot of newspapers, and it was actually discovered later that they'd doctored his eyes to make them look a bit more crazy than they'd shrunken the pupils, or done some things to the color and the configuration of his eyes to make him look crazier than he actually was.
About that. Yeah, crazy stuff, the media. Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about categorization of disorders?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So I run up against this quite a bit. I'm a geriatric care manager. This is Glenna in Oregon. And so I deal with a lot of different kinds of cognitive change. And just 2 days ago, I brought in what's called a professional organizer to go through the house of a client who has been moved to a long-term care setting. And so I need to get the house on the market, get it emptied out. And anyway, the house has 3 levels and it has a lot of stuff in it. But I don't consider this to be a hoarding situation. it just has a lot of stuff. It doesn't look pathological to me. But when I brought in a professional organizer who does things by algorithm, and she and I walked around the house, and I had already told her that I didn't think it was a hoarding situation, and we walked through the house, and she said, "Oh yeah, this is a level 5 hoarding." And I said, "You're kidding. You have a scale? You actually have an algorithm for hoarding?" And she said, "Yeah, this is a level 5." And I just shook my head, because I see it through a different lens. I see a situation, a lady who's 90 plus years old, who has a lifetime of stuff, who fell into ill health, couldn't deal with the day-to-day details of keeping her house tidy, and hired caregivers that came in and were engaged in taking care of her and not taking care of the house. And then there was a break-in. Somebody broke in and turned things up. And so I look at it through a much more complex lens, but the professional organizing profession comes in and feeds what they see into an algorithm, and they spit out a score. And I see this all the time. I see algorithmic judgments. And the thing that's really scary about it is that these kinds of algorithmic judgments are used to determine capacity, and to then take away rights and assign things like guardians and conservators. And it's very frightening. And so this gets kind of back to our opening discussion about the DSM and plant classification and all that. That's kind of what we've boiled down cognitive evaluations to, and it's very scary.
And when AI takes over, it's going to get even scarier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because it bothers me a lot.
Well, I think there's a robust literature against the DSM, and it's no accident that it was created by psychiatrists for psychiatrists, as it says in the DSM. And the puzzling part of it is that everybody has adopted it. And no one had to. Though I suppose one could make the argument that when the insurance companies required a DSM diagnosis or an ICD diagnosis, which are very similar, for reimbursement, then everybody had to adopt them. But there's no requirement that we take them seriously. I used to give people a copy of the DSM and tell them to pick a diagnosis that they wanted. And we could go with that, because they're not, they have not been subjected to scientific scrutiny. They lack validity and reliability. And anybody who suffers at any level has at least 4 diagnoses, if not 10. In the United States, you get paid more the more diagnoses you give someone. So the impetus is to give as many diagnoses as possible because you get more money. And so everybody has at least 10 diagnoses, if not more. So what value is it, really? And our government funding agency will not fund research that uses the DSM because they say that it's invalid and unscientific. This is the National Institutes of Mental Health. So you can't use DSM if you're applying to NIMH, but it still dominates the culture.
Yeah, and it determines care, and especially with regard to the use of psychotropic medications. And I see that all the time with the elderly. If they don't have an appetite, then prescribe Rimadyl. And if they're angry about getting in the shower, then prescribe haloperidol, and it goes on and on and on. It has become a gold standard of care. It's all based on algorithm and jargon.
Well,
Yep.
it's not the standard of care for, say, geriatric medicine.
It is out here.
In Oregon.
Yes, most
Well,
definitely. I did all of my graduate work on the abuse of psychotropic medications in the elderly.
mm.
Hmm.
Well, there's certainly a push in the northeastern United States to keep older people off psychotropic medication, and there's there are lovely programs in facilities to train staff in how to deal with people without medicating them. So I know that it exists, and
Wow, that's great.
there's something called the Beers criteria, which are against psychiatric medication for behavioral control.
Right.
We have something called quality counts, and it also preaches against this practice. So it's not,
I'm familiar with those things, but they are not yet widely in practice.
okay.
I would say it's the same situation in Australia, that polypharmacy with the elderly is people are beginning to recognise what a problem it is, and also with children, school students primarily. I think the elderly and children are probably the two groups, maybe the two groups who are hardest hit by this categorisation idea. I know out here, any kid who's a bit quirky or different is at risk of being placed on the spectrum and labelled with Asperger's, some kind of Asperger's label, or ADHD or something else. And in fact, a lot of access to funding in schools relies on getting a diagnosis. So it's a huge problem with kids out here.
And if they get it done, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that goes to the practice of age segregation. The young and the very old.
Yeah.
They are irritating. They are complicated, and so if you medicate them, it makes them easier to get along with.
Well, and I was telling my residents today, if you don't medicate older people with behavioral problems of dementia, so for every 100 years, for every 100 people years, 17 die. But if you give them haloperidol, 44 die for every 100 people years.
Well, then they're not at all irritating if that happens.
Well, there you
right.
go. So maybe that's the point, is to get rid of them. We were looking at, apparently quetiapine is only 22 people die for every 100 years. So it's apparently better by 22 people deaths than haloperidol.
Wow.
But it's pretty scary statistics.
Yeah, it's frightening stuff.
Yeah.
That is.
But, there's a program, I don't know if you've heard of the HELP program. It's the Healthy Elders Life Program, I think is what it stands for. It's a program it's a program that's implemented in general hospitals in the U.S., in some general hospitals, to prevent delirium for older people who are hospitalized. And it involves.
Well,
Yes, go ahead.
well, it's been my experience that here in the United States, I think that the northeastern part of the U.S. is the most progressive in elder care. That's where Dr. Bill Thomas, where the greenhouse model originated. There's a wonderful geriatrician by the name of Dr. Al Power. So the northeast part of the United States is way ahead of the rest of the U.S. in understanding elder care and deviating away from the gold standard of psychotropic medications.
Mm. Well, here in Maine, we have the oldest average population in the U.S.
Wow.
So I guess we have to do something for all these
Mm.
people. But but the help program is really effective, and one of our sister hospitals, Maine General Hospital in Augusta, saved $100,000 a year after $100,000 a month after implementing it. And
Okay, I'll research that. Thank you.
yeah, it comes out of Boston. I
Okay.
think it was created at Harvard. So
Okay.
it's definitely blue blood influence, but quite effective, and it uses all the behavioral things that people use anywhere to prevent worsening of delirium. So redirecting, trying to keep the day different from the night, clumping procedures so they don't all happen randomly, but they happen all at once. Volunteers coming in and interacting and entertaining people. Occupational therapy and nursing coming in and providing activities and redirection and all those things. So, it mirrors the work that's being done to eliminate the use of antipsychotic medication in nursing facilities and long-term care facilities, which is really lovely work and has been quite successful in Maine, in the facilities where it's been used to virtually eliminate antipsychotic medication. So it exists.
Great. I'll check it out. Thanks.
Yeah. But one of the things about Tim's method is that you don't actually need a diagnosis, and you don't actually need a history. You just jump in.
You just need a conversation.
That's right. And in some ways, I think in some ways my work is similar in that I just jump in. What's different is then I get a medical student to come by and get the life story, after the fact, and then we all read it, and it gives us a context for sort of understanding the work that we're doing. But the work is still in the present moment. Yeah, so there's a similarity there at least. So we're getting close to the end. It's been fun, and I've appreciated having Tim join us. Anyone have any final words before we sign off for the night, and for Tim, sign off for the morning?
Yeah.
I'm getting ready to go to sleep in about half an hour. So anyone have anything to add or to say? All right. Well, I'll say good night to everyone. Thank you for all of you for coming. I had a good time. And
I'll say good afternoon.
Oh, okay.
Still only
Good
4:30.
afternoon.
Yep, and good afternoon here too.
Yeah.
And I'll say good morning.
And I'll say good night.
It's a great world. Thanks so much, Lewis. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
See ya.
Good night.